All right, now that you have a basic understanding of the features and layout of Davinci Resolve, we're gonna go ahead and get started with color correction. Now, let's talk about the differences between color correction and color grading. Color correction is where we find any issues within the image, whether it's too dark, too bright, the white balance is wrong, anything, and we go ahead and fix those issues that we see. Color grading is where we add a specific style and a specific look to the image. So we want to do color correction before we do color grading. That way, once we color grade, we can apply a similar grade across all of the clips in the sequence, and it'll be a cohesive look throughout the project. All right, so starting with the color grading, we're gonna start with clip 1 here. Let's go ahead and find our hero shot. I'll scrub through this clip, and I like this shot right here. This is a good frame to start with. Now, sometimes it can be hard to see if there are any issues within the image. The primary things that I look for are exposure, contrast, and white balance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and on this first node, I'm going to desaturate the image. I'm going to come down here to our primary wheels, and I'm going to go ahead and take the saturation all the way out. And this way we can just see the brightness information in the image. I'm going to go ahead and add a new node using Option S on my keyboard or Alt S on Windows. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and use our offset to adjust our exposure. I'm going to go ahead and bring this down a little bit here, just darken the image a little bit just till it looks right and we get some of this information back in our waveform. And that's looking pretty good. If you need to look around on your image, you can always zoom in or zoom out using this percentage bar right here. Click on Fit to fit it back into the viewer. And let's look at our exposure adjustment before, after, looking a lot better. Now I'm going to keep this image desaturated for the time being because the next thing I want to do is add contrast. And I'm going to go ahead and do that on the same node. Now I could use the contrast slider right here, or I could use the curves. Personally, I like to use the curves since it gives me more control and more fine-tuning ability over the contrast. So I'm going to go ahead and maybe drag some of these shadows down a little bit here and bring up some of these midtones and create a nice roll off into the highlights. I'm going to bring my white point down a little bit, and that's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to go ahead and label this node exposure and contrast. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and disable node 1 by clicking on the number, and we can see that we've adjusted our exposure and contrast. If we turn off our exposure and contrast node, we can see the effect that it's had. And we've gotten a lot more information back in the sky, and we've created a much more pleasing image. And we can also take a look at the white balance in this image. Now, I know this was shot during sunset, so there is going to be somewhat of a yellow tint to the image, but let's just go ahead and play around with our white balance to see if we can balance this out just a little bit better. I'm going to go ahead and take my temp and introduce some more blue into the image, just cool things off a little bit. I want this pavement here to be more of a neutral color. So I'm bringing this back a little bit here, and let's see. Yeah, this is looking pretty good. I've cooled off the image a little bit. If we turn off our white balance node, turn it back on, we can see the effect it's had. And maybe I want to introduce a little bit of green as well, just to balance things out. Maybe bring our white balance back a little bit here. Just something like that. Looks pretty good. Before, after, a lot of the colors have been a lot more neutralized. Let's take a look at our tint a little bit more. Just kind of gently finesse it so that his arm here still looks natural, because that's where I'm seeing a lot of this tint taking place. I think I'm just going to go ahead and reset the tint, press 0, and enter. Now I'm going to go ahead and label this node white balance, or just WB. And we've adjusted our exposure, our contrast, and our white balance. Those are the top 3 things to pay attention to when you're color correcting footage. Now I'm going to go ahead and delete this first node since we no longer need it, and drag these over here. And we can see the before and after by coming up to this little circle button up here. Turn that off to turn off all of the adjustments, and click it to turn it back on. And I'm liking what we're seeing. This is with no adjustments, and then once we adjust our exposure, our contrast, and our white balance, then this is the result. So we can go ahead and apply the same process to the rest of the images in our timeline. I'm going to come to this next clip, and I'm going to desaturate it just like I did before. and then add a new node. And in this one, I'm gonna go ahead and brighten up things just a little bit here, take our offset up. I'll bring our gain down to bring some of those highlights back a little bit. And I'm thinking I wanna bring our lift back down just a little bit. Somewhere right around there looks pretty good. And then I want to introduce a little more contrast. We'll use our curves again here. And I'll bring my white point back down. And that's looking pretty good. We're gonna go ahead and label this node exposure and contrast. And let's go ahead and disable this first node to see what we've done. And we'll turn this node off as well. So the before and the after, we've got much better exposure, much better contrast. And I'm not seeing any white balance issues with this image, so we don't really need to worry about that. I'm gonna go ahead and delete this first node, and we can go ahead and move on to our next clip. So for this one, we're gonna go ahead and desaturate the first node just like last time. And I'm liking the exposure and contrast that we're seeing here. I think the exposure is spot on. At this point, all we need to do is really look at our contrast. We can see all of our information is sitting somewhere here in the middle and a little bit toward the bottom. So we're gonna go ahead and create a new node, and we're gonna go ahead and take our offset to brighten it up just a little bit here. And we're gonna introduce some contrast with our curves. Just something gentle like that looks pretty good. And then we'll go ahead and disable our first node. We'll disable our second node to see the adjustments that we've made. And overall, the contrast is really bringing out some of the colors in the image. It's important to recognize that when you're adjusting your contrast, you're also affecting your saturation at the same time. If you increase contrast, you'll actually be increasing the saturation a little bit as well. And I'm not seeing any white balance issues in this image either. And now we're gonna go ahead and label our nodes as always. Delete our first node, clean things up just a little bit, and we'll go ahead and move on to our next clip. Now for this next one, I'm noticing these colors look a little bit too cool. So if we go ahead and drag forward in our timeline, let's look at our guy who's walking by here, somewhere right around here. Okay, we're gonna focus on our exposure, our contrast, and then our white balance, and I think that's where we're gonna do most of the work for this clip. First, we're gonna go ahead and desaturate and then create a new node. We're actually gonna create two of them. We'll just go ahead and preemptively label this one exposure and contrast. And then we'll label this next one white balance, or just WB for short. All right, on node 2, we're gonna go ahead and adjust our exposure. I think I'm just gonna go ahead and bring up our gamma in our color wheels, bring down our gain a little bit here. And then in our curves, I'm just gonna go ahead and create some more contrast in those shadows. Something right around there looks pretty good. If we go ahead and disable this first node, we can see the contrast that we've adjusted. So this is a before and after. We've adjusted our exposure and contrast a little bit, and it's very subtle, but I think it brings out some of the colors in the image and helps it pop a little bit more. Now under our white balance, we're gonna go ahead and take a look at our temperature and our tint. This image is looking just a little bit too cool, so we're gonna go ahead and warm it up a little bit here. And we're gonna add some magenta. And that's looking a lot more accurate, a lot more true to the colors that we saw on location. Let's go ahead and scrub through our clip here just to make sure that everything looks good. We'll go ahead and disable all of our adjustments to see the before, the after. It's just small tweaks. It doesn't take much to correct the image. Now, sometimes you will have to deal with bigger problems, but having these basic tools at your disposal can help you do much more extensive image recovery and color correction. All right, we'll go ahead and delete our first node here, and we'll clean things up a little bit, and we'll move on to the next clip. Now, this one, the colors are looking pretty good, but things are looking a little dark in the face up here. So we're gonna go ahead and desaturate just like we did in the previous one. And then we're gonna create a couple more nodes here, come to our second node, and we're gonna brighten things up a little bit. I'm gonna drag up on our offset, and I'm gonna go ahead and bring the shadows down in our curves. Something like that looks pretty good. We can go ahead and disable our second node to see the adjustments we've made. We've kept a lot of that rich contrast in the shadows while brightening up the overall skin tone and all the midtones as well. If we go ahead and disable our first node, we can see the effect that we've had. If we disable the second node, we can see a lot of the colors are fairly muted. It looks good, but it's just kind of dull and doesn't have any life to it, and it's a little dark up here in the face. But if we turn on our second node, we can see that we've brought some of that brightness out a little bit, and we've also increased a little bit of saturation by creating some of this contrast here. Now we can see that it looks a little muddy up here because some of those blacks have been raised. So we're going to go ahead and take our black point on our curves, and we're just going to drag that ever so slightly to the right just to increase that contrast in the shadows. And we'll adjust our shadows just a little bit here. And we'll also adjust our highlights slightly. Something like that looks pretty good. And I'm not seeing any white balance issues here either. So we're going to go ahead and delete this third node, delete our first node, label this node exposure and contrast. And we're going to move on to our next clip. Scrubbing through the clip, we'll find our hero shot, our main frame that we want to look at for reference. Let's stick with this one right about here. I'm liking this one. So we've got some skin tones, we've got some sky and some neutral brick colors. I'm noticing that overall this image is leaning a little bit toward the warmer side of things, but we'll get to that once we start doing our other corrections. First, we're just going to go ahead and desaturate just like we've been doing. And we'll go ahead and create a new node, Option S if you're on Mac or Alt S on Windows. And then we're going to go ahead and adjust our contrast. I think our exposure is pretty spot on, so I'm just going to create some contrast by dragging these highlights up a little bit and dragging these shadows down. Very slight, but it introduces a little bit more contrast and creates a little bit more pop in those colors. We're going to go ahead and disable our first node, and then we'll take a look at the effect our second node has had. If we turn this off, it still looks kind of dull. Turn it back on. There's a lot more life and a lot more contrast and rich, deep colors. So we're going to go ahead and label this one contrast. And we'll add a new node, Option S or Alt S. And on this one, we're going to go ahead and take a look at our white balance. If we go ahead and right click on the image, you click on Show Color Picker RGB Value, and then it'll show you the red, green, and blue values of any area that you're hovering over. So here we've got our red value, which is 181, green 159, and blue 142. This shows us that there's more red and green in the image than there is blue, which tells us that the image is leaning slightly toward the warm side of things. This color is usually gray on these kinds of bricks, so we're going to go ahead and come down to our temperature, and we're going to cool this thing off just a little bit here. Come back over to our brick. And there's still a good amount of red in the image, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce a little bit more green to counteract some of that more magenta red color. And we'll cool it off a little bit more. Bring our green back a little bit here. And while we're not quite perfect, this is looking a lot more even. I might introduce just a tiny bit more green. And that's looking better. We're going to go ahead and label this node white balance. Now, while this isn't perfect, we are a lot closer. One thing you can do is you can also take a look at your RGB curves down here and use these to color correct your image. We're going to click on this little chain link to break them apart, and we're just going to focus on the red curve. If we take the red out by dragging down, we're introducing more green and cyan. And if we introduce more red, it's more like red magenta. So I'm going to go ahead and reset this. And I'm going to create a point here. Just try to keep it on that line. And I'm going to take some of this red out of the highlights just a little bit here to neutralize those skin tones, since we do see quite a bit of red in this skin. Now, I don't want to take too much out and introduce any sort of cyan colors in, but I just want to neutralize these colors a little bit. And we can see the effect it's had. It's a lot closer to a more natural neutral skin tone. So we're going to go ahead and delete this first node, clean this thing up a little bit here, and we'll move on to our next clip. Now this is more of a YouTube style video, things that you would expect if you're filming yourself. And in here we can see that we do have a couple of issues. It's a little too dark for starters, and our white balance is a little bit off. So we're going to go ahead and desaturate just like we've been doing. Create a couple more nodes here, and we'll come to our second node. Now let's just go ahead and relink all of these curves. So we're going to go ahead and click on the Y, then click on the chain link, and they're all connected back together. Now I'm going to go ahead and brighten this image up a little bit using our offset, something like that. Bring our gain down to bring back some of these highlights that we were losing. And we're going to go ahead and add some contrast using our curves. Something like that is looking pretty good. Pretty happy with that. So we're going to go ahead and disable this first node, and we'll turn this second node off, turn it back on, and overall we're getting much better exposure, much better contrast in our image. I'm going to go ahead and delete this first node since we don't need that anymore. We'll go ahead and label this one exposure and contrast. And then on this second node, we're going to go ahead and label it white balance. Now we're going to go ahead and focus on some of the color cast that we see in this image. I'm noticing that things are a little bit warm. This wall back here shouldn't be so green. It should have a little bit more blue in it. So we're going to go ahead and cool this image off just a little bit. Something like that looks about right. And then we're going to go ahead and take a look at our tint. And I know that this shirt doesn't look purple in real life, so we're going to go ahead and add some green to color correct that just a little bit here. Now when we're working with skin, it's important to make sure that we get skin accurate. So what we can do is we can come over to our waveform and click on our vector scope instead. And we're going to go ahead and create a mask just to look at our skin. If you click on this button right here, this is our power window button. You're going to click on the circle, and you're just going to drag it over the face, resize it just till skin is filling up the frame, and then you'll press Shift H on your keyboard to see only that selection. Now we can go ahead and see where the colors are at on the skin. They're kind of leaning towards red, but there's a magic line between yellow and red where we want our skin to fall. In order to see that, we're going to go ahead and click on these controls right here, and then click on the Show Skin Tone Indicator button. Click that, and click outside of it, and we've got this magic line right here. And you can see that based on the white balance adjustments that we've done already, we've brought the skin right back onto this line exactly. So we're going to go ahead and disable our mask. Just go ahead and click this button again right here. And we can go ahead and see that we've brought all of our colors back onto the skin tone line. Now, some colors are shifting a little bit towards green, and we can go ahead and we can fix that. What we're going to do is come under our curves, and we're going to go to our hue versus hue curves. Now, I'm going to create a little point right here. Just click where you want to adjust the color, and I'm going to adjust this and make it slightly more red. Just a slight adjustment is all we need. And I want this shirt to be a little bit more blue, not so neutral gray. So I'm going to click right there. I'm going to go ahead and widen this selection area just to get a wider area to work with. And I'm going to go ahead and adjust the colors just a little bit. Something like that looks good. And if we turn off our white balance node, turn it back on, we've brought the colors back to where they should be. Another thing we can do is we can make sure that our whites are white. We can go ahead and click on our mask again, and then just drag it over towards any areas of the frame that should be white. And we can see that there's nothing reaching out toward the edges. All of the color is sitting right here on this center dot on our vector scope. Now we're going to go ahead and disable this mask. Now I'm going to show you another way to white balance your image. We're going to go ahead and create a new node, Option S or Alt S to create a new node. Click on the number to disable our second node, and now we're going to come back to our curves just to get out of this power window option. And another way to white balance our image is to come over here toward this color picker right here under our primaries wheels. Click on that and then come to an area that should be white. You're going to go ahead and click on it, and then it'll automatically white balance the image for you. If it didn't do it quite right, you can click on another area that might have more of a color cast, Click on that and it'll white balance and neutralize any of those whites for you. This can give pleasing results if you don't have a lot of time to white balance manually. All right, with our next shot, this is an interview scenario, and overall we've got really good colors. The only thing that I'm seeing that we need to adjust is our contrast. So we're gonna go ahead and desaturate just like last time. Create a new node here. We're gonna go ahead and just label this contrast. By the way, you can label these whatever you want. Just make sure that it reminds you of which tools you're using and what the goal of this node was. So I'm just going to use these curves to increase our contrast, bring our shadows down and our highlights up a little bit here. Something like that looks pretty good. Disable this first node and then take a look at the effect that we're having with our second node. Overall, we can see a lot of the colors just pop a lot more and we get a lot richer tones in his skin. At first, everything was kind of just flat and muddy and desaturated, but once we added this contrast, everything just pops a lot more. So we're gonna go ahead and delete this first node and we'll just bring this back over here. Now, one thing to note about skin tones, all skin fits somewhere along this line. It doesn't matter the ethnicity or the race, all skin fits on this line because it's made up of the same stuff. It may have a slight yellow or red bias, but it will all fit somewhere on this line. And the goal here is just to get skin to look natural. Sometimes fitting skin directly on this line may not always work for every scenario, depending on the other colors in the environment. So just be cautious of how you color correct your skin tones. If we move on to our next shot, we can see, again, same guy here, and we can see that some of our shadows here are a little too dark. Up here in the hair, we can't really see any of the details in there. So we're gonna go ahead and again, desaturate on the first node, create another node after it. And I wanna go ahead and take a look at my primaries color wheels. And I'm gonna bring up my gamma because this is gonna bring up mostly the midtones, but it's also going to affect all the other tonal ranges in the image. I just wanna bring it up just enough till I see some of this detail and texture in his hair. Once we see that, then I'm gonna go ahead and bring back my gain because we've overexposed on his forehead here. I'm gonna go ahead and switch to my waveform just to see what I'm looking at. And I'm gonna bring back some of our gain so that we get some detail on his skin without it blowing out past the waveform. I'll just go ahead and bring that back gently here. And I'm gonna go ahead and add some contrast. Now something like that looks pretty good. We're gonna go ahead and disable this first node to see the adjustments. Now I can see that I do wanna add a little bit more contrast to bring out his skin here just a little bit more. So I'm gonna bring these shadows down just a little bit here. Play with these tones, maybe just delete that point and just bring this somewhere right around there. Looks pretty good. Now I'm gonna go ahead and bring my black point to the right just a little bit here, just to create more contrast in our shadows. And I'm liking what we've got here. I'm gonna go ahead and delete this first node and label this node exposure and contrast. And we'll just clean this up a little bit here. And there you go, my full color correction process. Now sometimes you may have to do more extensive color correction work, but since most of these clips already were pretty close to the final color that we wanted to begin with, we didn't have to do a lot. In the next video, we're going to be talking about color grading.